Hello everyone, and thank you for choosing to spend your evening here with me. If you enjoy these stories, I'd truly appreciate your subscription, like, and comment. It only takes a second for you, but it means the world to me and helps make each video even better. Now, get comfortable and let's begin. And now imagine this. You lie down. You stop moving. You stop planning. You stop trying to be someone specific. And yet, something in you continues with a constancy that does not require your permission. It is not a thought, because thoughts can disperse. It is not a feeling, because feelings can fade. It is not even a breath, because a breath can be held for a moment, like a small experiment. If you remain motionless long enough, what seems strange is not that the body continues to function. What is strange is that it continues to function according to specific patterns. The body does not just burn like a candle that refuses to go out. It coordinates itself. It plans itself. It checks the time with itself. And in the silence, when muscles stop making constant micro-decisions, eyes stop scanning, and hands stop interacting with objects, the hidden coordination becomes easier to feel, not as a mystical presence, but as a physical fact. Something continues to move without being movement. Something continues to speak without having a voice, and this happens through the repeated rearrangement of charges across thin boundaries, as if life is a kind of careful refusal to let everything balance out. We do not know for certain what the first people who noticed life's rhythms felt, but we know what it looks like now when we decide to measure it. The first clear revelation of the night is obvious. Even in sleep, the body represents a landscape of voltage, and this voltage leaves traces that can be recorded from the surface. A small set of sensors on the skin can capture the electrical wave of the heart. Another set can capture the collective rhythms of the cortex, not by reading thoughts, but by picking up large-scale patterns of synchronized activity. It is not striking that machines can do this. It is striking that the body offers something stable enough to be detected through layers of tissue, skin, and air without opening a single cell. Life is often imagined as an internal furnace, hidden chemistry, a private flame. However, the evidence suggests that it is also an electrical architecture, a field of differences maintained on membranes, coordinated in time, and becoming visible when the body becomes quiet enough to stop drowning in its own noise. In wakefulness, this noise is useful. It is the noise of action. In sleep, the noise subsides, and what remains is not emptiness, but structure, like the texture of wood appearing when the varnish is rubbed off. At the most microscopic level, the basis of this structure is almost disappointingly simple, which is usually a sign of truth. Most living cells maintain an electrical difference between the internal and external environment. The resting membrane potential is created because ions are not allowed to distribute themselves evenly. The cellular membrane, thin and selective, behaves not like a wall, but like a set of rules. Some ions pass more easily than others, and pumps and channels constantly shape what can accumulate. The result is a stable imbalance, a quiet tension held at a boundary only a few nanometers thick. We do not need to romanticize this to recognize that it is striking. A living cell is an organization of aqueous chemistry that holds charges separated in a way that dead matter cannot maintain for long. This resting potential is not a dramatic impulse. It is a baseline maintained even when behavior ceases, even when a person sleeps, even when the mind does not maintain a narrative about itself. It is the fundamental condition that makes the existence of excitable tissues possible at all, because without a basic difference, there is no meaningful change, no signal, no threshold to cross. Even cells that never conduct a nerve impulse still maintain electrical conditions that affect transport, volume, and readiness. In this sense, the electricity of the body begins not as lightning, but as disciplined stillness, a stored asymmetry that is restored continuously. The data suggests that if you want to find something similar to a life force that is not mystical, you should first look at the labor of maintaining gradients intact. Sleep does not cancel this labor. It changes its form. When an organism enters sleep mode, electrical activity becomes more distinct on the scale of networks. This is one of the subtle shocks of modern physiology. A sleeping brain is not electrically boring. In many ways, it is more organized. During non-rapid eye movement sleep, large populations of neurons transition into synchronized rhythms, generating slow waves and spindles that can be detected using electroencephalography. As large-scale patterns on the surface of the scalp, the precise mechanisms are complex and still being refined, but the general conclusion holds. At certain stages of sleep, electrical activity becomes more rhythmic, more stereotypical, more collective, as if the brain has moved from improvisation to maintenance procedures requiring coordination at a distance. At the same time, the balance of the autonomic nervous system changes. Heart rate changes, blood pressure patterns shift. In many people, breathing becomes more regular, and the internal regulation of the body emphasizes restoration and stability. None of this means that the brain rests in the mundane sense of the word. It means that sleep is a different mode of organization, with its own electrical signatures, its own timing systems, and its own vulnerabilities. When we say that sleep restores strength, the facts point to the fact that electrical order and metabolic maintenance are interconnected. The body may be quiet in its external behavior, but inside it is still a conversation between tissues, coordinated by signals that are partly chemical and partly electrical in living matter. They are inseparable. It is here that one common misconception creeps in, because the word electricity is too crude for what biology does. In ordinary life, electricity often means power that feeds appliances, energy that turns into heat and light when it meets resistance. But in physiology, much of what we call electrical is closer to coordination than to power. A nerve impulse is not a tiny wire carrying electrons through metal. It is a changing state of the membrane, a wave of ion movement that opens and closes channels in a precisely calibrated cascade. The signal is a pattern recreated throughout the entire length of the axon, rather than a substance moving from one end to the other like water in a pipe. Similarly, the electrical activity of the heart is not a battery discharge directly powering contraction. It is a timing system that tells muscle fibers when to contract in a coordinated sequence, so that mechanical pumping is effective. Electricity here is a language of planning. It sets thresholds, triggers release, synchronizes distant regions, and allows tissues to behave as a single whole. Energy in the metabolic sense is paid for chemically, mainly through ATP generated by cellular respiration. Electricity is how much of this energy is directed with high precision. This is important because it changes the tone of the question. If the body were powered by electricity, like a lamp from an outlet, it would seem alien and mechanistic. If the body uses voltage, mainly as a way of coordinating living tissue in time, then the strangeness becomes quieter and more intimate. It means that the body is not just burning fuel, it organizes itself moment by moment, like a city whose traffic lights never sleep. Stillness makes this organization more noticeable for a reason that is both technical and almost philosophical. In a state of wakefulness, the nervous system is flooded with sensory data, motor plans, corrections, microtremors, and constant negotiations between intention and the environment. All this activity is real electrical work, but it is complex, multi-layered, and noisy. When the body freezes, the noise level drops, muscles stop creating as many electrical artifacts, eyes close, and visual processing changes. Demands for posture and movement decrease. The brain can sink into slower oscillations large enough to be clearly recorded on the scalp, and the heart rhythm can be mapped more clearly against a quieter baseline background. It is not that the sleeping body becomes more electrical, it is that it becomes more readable. The same currents that were always there become easier to separate from the turbulence of waking life. In the silence, one can detect the difference between a system that is simply active and a system that is organized. For the same reason, archaeologists prefer undisturbed layers. When the soil is plowed, everything is in place, but nothing is clear. When the layers lie still, The sequence of events can be traced. Stillness is not emptiness. Stillness is the reduction of interference. And interference is often what hides the structure. Thus, the first premise of this release takes its place without requiring faith. The body is not metaphorically electrical. It is electrically organized matter. This organization is built on ion gradients across membranes, and on coordinated changes in these gradients over time. It persists when behavior ceases, and it becomes easier to see when the body is calm. We do not know for certain how this feels from the inside, because most of this process never reaches consciousness, and perhaps it is a mercy that it is so. A person who could feel every movement of an ion would never sleep, but the facts suggest that beneath the story you tell yourself about your day, there is an older story told in timing, in thresholds, in the controlled opening and closing of channels, in waves of activation that move through tissues like weather over a plane. There is no drama in this, and that is why it is compelling. The process continues whether you are impressed by it or not, and there is a gentle, almost dry comfort in that. You can be tired, confused, triumphant, or numb, and the underlying coordination does not take it personally. It continues its work with the patience of a process that arose hundreds of millions of years before your concerns. A sleeping person is not an inactive body, but a quieter instrument, and it is in the silence that the hidden current becomes most noticeable. Before we touch upon instruments or equations, we must understand why people decided at all that life possesses a special electricity. A severed frog leg lies on a table in a room that smells faintly of metal, damp skin, and what remains after the last thunderstorm. The animal has long passed anything that would resemble intention. No breath, no gaze, no struggle. And then, under the influence of a simple spark, the muscle jerks not with the slow settling of something falling, but with a sharp, unmistakable twitch, as if a fragment of life were momentarily convinced to speak again. This is the very movement that makes the mind distrust itself, because it seems too purposeful for a dead thing. At the end of the 18th century, when natural philosophers were still arguing about whether life contains a special principle that cannot be reduced to ordinary matter, such a moment was more than just a curiosity. It was a small crisis. The movement of the limb was not a metaphor. It was visible, repeatable, and stubborn. And once you see, for the first time, how a dead muscle reacts to an electrical stimulus, it becomes difficult to pretend that living motion consists only of spirit, or only of will, or only of some private essence placed inside the flesh like a secret coin. We do not know for certain what Luigi Galvani felt in the first moment the experiment succeeded, because feelings are not preserved as clear fossils, and scientific biographies mostly leave behind papers, but the evidence suggests that he approached the question with the cautious seriousness befitting his time and his city. Galvani worked in Bologna, in a Europe where electricity had become fashionable and strange, a phenomenon both public and technical. In the salons and lecture halls of the Enlightenment, people watched sparks leap from generators, saw hair rise under an electric charge, and treated the nerve force as both entertainment and a doorway into nature's hidden order. Galvani's attention, however, was fixed on the body. He noticed that a frog's muscles could be made to contract with certain touches, especially when metal instruments and electrical devices were involved. Over time, he developed an interpretation. The animal itself contained an internal electricity, a kind of animal electricity, and the metals and sparks did not create motion from nothing, but merely released what was already present in the living tissue. In the early 1790s, he published his work in a treatise whose title alone speaks to the ambition of his claims, Commentary on the Effects of Electricity on Muscular Motion. This was not a mystical text. It was an attempt to move the question of life into the realm of experimental demonstration. The contraction of a muscle became an argument that could be repeated, rather than just a story that could be told. This was important because it went against an ancient and still powerful habit of thought. For centuries, many explanations of life relied on special substances or principles, vital forces. that distinguished the living from the non-living in a way that could not be investigated, using the same physics that governs rocks and water. The late 18th century did not abandon these ideas suddenly, but it began to corner them. Galvani's experiments did not prove that life is merely electricity. They did something more subtle and, ultimately, more important. They showed that at least one part of life, muscular motion, could be triggered and studied through physical intervention that obeyed rules. Contraction could be induced again and again and again under conditions that could be described. It did not require prayer. It did not require the presence of a soul. It required a specific arrangement of tissues and conductors. This transition from secret essence to public demonstration is what shattered the old frameworks. When a claim can be tested, it becomes vulnerable to correction, but it also becomes real in a new way. Galvani believed he had revealed electricity as a property of animal bodies, rather than an external force acting upon them. In his understanding, the organism contained an accumulated electrical nature, and the metals formed a circuit that allowed it to express itself in motion. Even if later science revised this interpretation, the methodological step itself was irreversible. The living body became a legitimate object for electrical measurement and experimental repeatability. Then came Alessandro Volta, and with him came the kind of productive dispute that science needs more than it is willing to admit. Volta did not deny the fact of muscle contraction. He denied the conclusion. He suggested that the metals themselves, when connected, could generate electricity upon contact, and that it was this electricity that stimulated the muscle. Where Galvani saw internal animal electricity released by the metal, Volta saw external electricity created by the interaction of different conductors and transmitted to the tissue. The dispute was not merely personal, it was conceptual and forced a drive for clarity. If contraction could be explained without invoking a special electrical substance belonging exclusively to animals, then animal electricity might turn out to be a redundant category. Volta explored this question with that stubborn mastery that reshapes the form of knowledge. By the end of the 18th century, he had created devices that did not depend on animal tissues at all. Combinations of metals and electrolytes producing stable electrical effects. In 1800, he announced the invention of what would later be called the voltaic pile, structured stack of dissimilar metals separated by moist material that created a continuous source of electricity. It was not a spark, it was a power source. This moved electricity from the realm of fleeting spectacles into the realm of sustained experimentation. In doing so, Volta strengthened the idea that electricity could arise from physical interactions and chemical processes without requiring a unique living ingredient. Taking a step back, it becomes clear why this dispute was so important. It did not resolve the question of the nature of life, but it changed the rules of the argument. Galvani's view leaned toward the idea that animals carry an internal electrical principle linked to their vital force. Volta's view leaned toward an electrochemical model in which electricity can be produced, controlled, and measured using non-living materials and then applied to tissue. Over time, the burgeoning science did what it often does. It absorbed parts of both views and discarded what did not withstand measurement. Later, physiology would show that living tissues are indeed linked to electrical phenomena, but not as a special fluid that animals possess like a secret organ. Instead, electrical effects arise from ions, membranes, and chemical gradients. In other words, there is electricity in biology, but it is not a separate substance set aside for living beings. It is the movement of charge in salt water, guided by structures that regulate what can cross a boundary and when. Galvani was right that this phenomenon belongs to the body in the deepest way. Volta was right that it could be understood without invoking a mystical electricity, exclusive to life, and that chemistry and surrounding materials matter. The final correction is quiet, but decisive. The electrical behavior of the body is physical, and because it is physical, it can be studied with the same demand for clarity that we apply to everything else. It is also worth noting, with respectful simplicity, why the muscle specifically became such a compelling stage for the first demonstrations. The body does many things invisibly. It secretes, filters, balances, restores. The muscle, however, declares itself. Contraction is instantaneous and visual. It is a direct bridge between cause and effect. When a muscle moves, one does not need a special education to see it. This made it ideal for a new kind of science trying to convince skeptics. A simple twitch could silence an entire audience. And because muscle contraction could be induced reliably, it became a laboratory truth independent of anyone's philosophical beliefs. Looking back, one can see a profound shift occurring under the cover of experiment. The living body was being pulled into the same world as instruments and measurements, not as a simplification intended to strip it of meaning, but as a method intended to protect inquiry from fantasy. This is often the paradox of scientific humility. To say we can test, this is not to say this is simple. It is to say, we are ready for reality to correct us. The Enlightenment did not end superstition, but it created new tools for rejecting it. Galvani and Volta, in their disagreement, helped create one such tool. The first deep lesson was not that we are magical beings, but that we are measurable, and measurement often becomes the beginning of genuine reverence. There is a special kind of wonder that comes when a phenomenon leaves the realm of rumor and enters the realm of repeated observation. This wonder is quieter than myth, but it is sturdier. A twitching frog leg might sound small, even a bit grim, yet it opened the way to understanding the nervous system, the heart, and how living tissues coordinate themselves without conscious commands. It also changed the language people use to speak about life. Once you know that the body's movements can be influenced by electrical conditions, you stop speaking of movement only as embodied intention. You begin to speak of mechanisms, pathways, signals, thresholds. Not because you want to strip life of mystery, but because the real mystery turns out to be compatible with physics. It is compatible with salt, metal, and moist tissue. It is compatible with the fact that a living being can be studied, without diminishing its significance, if the inquiry is conducted with restraint. And in a way, this concerns each of us personally. This story suggests that our deepest experiences rest on processes that are older than our ideas about ourselves. The body does not need us to understand it for it to function. But when we understand a little more, it becomes harder to fear it in a superstitious way. The unknown does not disappear. It simply moves to the edge of what can be tested where it belongs. Once life could be set in motion with an electric shock, the next question became quieter and more complex. How does the signal travel without a wire? A thought forms somewhere in the darkness of your skull, and instead of staying where it arose, it becomes a traveling event. It moves. It arrives. It triggers something else. It does this fast enough for you to catch a falling cup, turn your head toward a sound, or swallow without delving into the geometry of your own throat. And yet, the signal leaves almost no trace behind. At least, not the traces we are used to. There is no smoke, no abrasion, no visible rut worn into the tissues like a path in the mud. Whatever moved without consuming the very road it traveled. This is the paradox. How can an internal message travel quickly through moist living matter, remain accurate, and not wear out the path with each passage? If you sit with this question long enough, it begins to seem less biological and more like a problem of physics and information. Not because the body is cold or mechanical, but because it is bound by the same rules as everything else. A signal moving in water has to struggle with diffusion, noise, and heat. A signal moving in tissues has to survive in a world made of salt, protein, and constant motion. The fact that it works at all should already make you suspicious of simple analogies. For a long time, the nervous system inclined people toward a wrong metaphor: wires. If electricity exists in bodies, then perhaps nerves are wires, the brain is a battery, and thought is a current flowing from one place to another. This is an attractive picture because it is easy to hold in the mind, but the facts accumulated in the early and mid-20th century did not confirm this picture. The turning point came thanks to an animal that doesn't care about our metaphors, the squid. In the mid-20th century, the giant axon of certain squid species became something of a gift to physiology, not because it was more advanced, but because it was larger. Squids evolved unusually wide nerve fibers to control rapid escape responses in water, and these fibers could be worked on using the tools of that time. Their diameter was so large, often on the order of 0.5 millimeter to a full millimeter, that researchers could insert electrodes and measure voltage in ways that were extremely difficult in the thin nerves of mammals. We don't know for sure if anyone back then felt the quiet absurdity of the situation, but the data suggests that this is often how science moves forward. A deep question meets a convenient organism, not an ideal model, but simply a working one. The squid axon allowed the invisible electrical life of the nerve to be made measurable with a precision that didn't require futuristic technologies. It opened the door simply because it was large enough to be touched. This size mattered because it allowed for something more than just observation. It allowed for controlled measurements. By the time Alan Hodgkin and Andrew Huxley were working, especially in the years before the end of the 1930s and after World War II, physiology had reached a stage where description alone was no longer enough. One could stimulate a nerve and see a response, but that only said that something had happened. The deeper question was, how? How does the change in voltage unfold over time? How does it depend on the membrane? And why does it propagate? The squid axon could be connected to equipment in such a way that researchers could view the nerve impulse as a physical event with variables: voltage, current, time, and the properties of the surrounding solution. They could record the shape of the impulse with clarity. They could manipulate the conditions. And, critically, they could begin to separate what was happening in the membrane from what was happening in the fluid around it. This is the moment when the story stops being a fairy tale about sparks and starts becoming a story about measurements that can be repeated, plotted as graphs, and discussed with numbers in hand. The axon became a quiet workbench where a layer of poetry could be stripped from the nervous system without stripping away its fascination. One of the most important results of this work was the realization that a nerve impulse is not a simple flow like a current in copper. In a copper wire, electrons drift under the influence of an electric field, and the wire doesn't need to restore itself as the signal moves. The wire is already conductive, and the field propagates through it. In a nerve, the situation is different. The membrane is not freely conductive. It is a boundary with selective permeability, and the impulse is a temporary change in the behavior of this boundary. The action potential, as it came to be understood, is regenerative. This word matters. It means that the signal doesn't just pass along a pre-existing conductive path. Instead, at every point of the axon, the local membrane undergoes a change that creates the same voltage event, which then forces the next segment to do the same. The signal is copied forward. It does not pull forward. That is exactly why it can travel long distances without decaying, like ripples on a pond. The impulse is maintained because the membrane actively participates in its recreation moment by moment. That is why a nerve is not just a wet wire. It is a line of excitable boundary capable of switching states in a controlled sequence. The impulse is a moving pattern of state changes, not a single packet of charge sliding through a tube. To make this assertion meaningful, researchers had to face what the membrane was actually doing. The data suggested that ions move across the membrane in ways that are timed and selective, and that these movements change the voltage across the membrane, which in turn changes the movements themselves, even before the molecular structure of many ion channels had been studied in detail. Thus, a functional concept emerged. Paths lead through the membrane that behave like gates rather than pipes. A pipe would allow a continuous flow depending mainly on pressure. Gates, however, open and close according to rules. In nerves, these rules depend on the voltage itself. Certain conductivities rise sharply when the membrane depolarizes, allowing sodium ions to rush in, and then these conductivities inactivate, while others increase more slowly, allowing potassium ions to move in a direction that restores resting conditions. This interaction gives rise to the characteristic rise and fall of the action potential. This is exactly why the signal has a refractory period a short time after the impulse, during which the membrane cannot fire the same way again. This refractory period is not a design flaw. It is part of what ensures directionality and intervals, preventing the signal from dissolving into continuous noise. Thus, a nerve impulse is a timed event with constraints, like a controlled ignition, that cannot be immediately repeated at the same point. The body avoids electrical chaos by embedding rules into the behavior of the membrane, rules that are automatic and indifferent to our desires. This is where Hodgkin and Huxley did something that changed the very notion of what it means to understand. They didn't stop at describing the shape of the action potential. They built a mathematical model that could reproduce it. In the early 1950s, a series of their papers in the Journal of Physiology presented a framework in which membrane conductivity could be described by differential equations, capturing how conductivity for sodium and potassium changes over time and depending on voltage. They used methods such as the voltage clamp, which allows an experimenter to hold the membrane at a given voltage and measure the flowing currents, separating cause and effect in a way that ordinary recording cannot. The achievement was not that they made the nerve less mysterious, it was that they made the mystery explainable. A model that predicts a waveform under certain conditions is a statement that can be tested. If the model fails, it does so openly. If it is successful, it deserves trust without requiring faith. The Hodgkin-Huxley model did not name ion channels as proteins with their own structures. There was no need for that. It described membrane behavior in a way that could be measured, quantified, and generalized. It taught physiology that a living process can be simultaneously chaotic and mathematically describable, not because life is a machine, but because life is bounded by frameworks and, therefore, has patterns. This changed the culture of neuroscience. Explanation became something that could be calculated, rather than just retold. From this follows a principle that will quietly echo throughout this entire issue. Living electricity is a controlled instability, not a steady burn. The nerve membrane is in a stable state of rest, maintained by ionic gradients and active transport. But it is frozen near thresholds that can trigger rapid transitions. When the right conditions arise, the membrane becomes unstable in a strictly defined way, and then returns to stability. Instability is not a failure. It is the point. It allows for rapid switching. It allows signals to be discrete, to have a beginning and an end, to be countable and synchronized. However, because the instability is controlled by the rules of the membrane gates and the surrounding gradients, it usually does not slide into irreversible disorder. This is a subtle kind of engineering that evolution arrived at without blueprints. It is a compromise between responsiveness and safety. To stable, and nothing can signal to unstable, and everything signals at once. The action potential is what happens when a system repeatedly balances on this edge, with a reliability sufficient to build perception and movement upon it. And when you step back, the strange elegance becomes clearer. A nerve signal is not energy consumed as it moves, but a pattern recreated step by step, like a message being copied on the go. Yes, it uses energy, because restoring gradients requires ATP, but the movement itself is not a single flow, exhausting itself along the route. The message persists because each segment of the membrane participates in its generation anew, like a sequence of torches lit one after another, where the flame is not transported but replicated. If signals travel due to the selectivity of membranes, then the next layer of excavation will be the membrane itself and the gradient it protects. The most important wall in your body is thinner than anything you can see, thinner than dust, thinner than the finest line you could draw, and yet it holds differences great enough to decide whether a muscle will contract, whether a gland will secrete, whether a cell will stay alive. We tend to think of walls as something thick, stony, resisting by their very mass. But this boundary resists by way of rules. It is a film of lipids and proteins that does not look like a fortress, And that is the first shock. Ordinary water mixed with salt seeks equilibrium. Particles drift. Concentrations level out. Nature is patient and prefers flatness, a quiet final state where differences dissolve. A living cell does not accept this preference. It builds itself as a refusal of equal access. It holds certain ions predominantly outside, others predominantly inside, and maintains this imbalance minute after minute, as if guarding a shoreline against a tide that never stops pressing. The membrane is impressive not because it is sturdy. It is impressive because of its selectivity. It turns simple salt water into something like a charged landscape, controlling who crosses the border and when. And it does this everywhere, in every tissue, without applause. If you could shrink enough to stand beside it, you would not hear the noise of machinery. You would feel the constant pressure of possibility, like the stored energy before a thunderstorm. The pure revelation is that an ionic gradient is a form of stored potential created by separation, not by simple quantity. In everyday life, we understand stored energy best as something stacked in a pile, a wood pile, a full tank, a weight lifted onto a shelf. But in cells, one of the most powerful ways to store readiness is simply to keep things apart. Place more ions on one side of a membrane than on the other, and you create a difference that can perform work when the gates open. The work may be electrical in the sense of a voltage change, or chemical in the sense of triggering transport, or mechanical in the sense of triggering contraction. The point is that separation itself becomes a resource. It is like water pressure behind a dam. Only the dam is molecular, and the pressure is created by statistical impatience. Ions move because there are more of them here than there, and because random motion prefers the simple fairness of uniform distribution. When a boundary denies this fairness, it accumulates a debt that can later be paid out as force. This is why one can say without romance that a cell is a kind of battery. Not a battery made of metal plates and acid, but a battery of aqueous chemistry and stubborn boundaries. The membrane does not create energy from nothing. It creates the conditions under which energy can be stored as a difference. And difference is what living systems spend. Once you accept that separation is valuable, the next level is to notice that not all ions are equal, and the organism uses their differences with careful opportunism. Potassium, sodium, chloride, calcium each carries a charge, but each also carries a history of how it interacts with proteins and membranes, how abundant it is in the extracellular space compared to the intracellular, how quickly it can be moved, and how dangerous it can become if it accumulates in the wrong place. Potassium is often maintained at high levels inside many cells, sodium at high levels outside, and this asymmetry sets the baseline electrical bias. Chloride participates in ways that vary by tissue and developmental stage, sometimes stabilizing electrical states, sometimes providing inhibitory effects, sometimes simply following other gradients. It can also influence cell volume, because it pulls the behavior of water along with it. Calcium is the element treated almost ceremoniously, so carefully. Its concentration inside the cell is often maintained at an extremely low level, compared to the external environment, not because calcium is undesirable, but because it is powerful. When calcium rushes into the cytosol through channels, it can trigger cascades of events: secretion, contraction, gene expression, metabolic shifts. In some cells, calcium is not just a participant but a signal, an intentional alarm. This is why its gradient is steep and access is tightly controlled. Different electrical states in different tissues are determined by how these ions are distributed, and how permeable the membranes of each tissue are to each of them at rest and during activation. A neuron, a muscle cell, and a gland cell differ electrically not because they are made of different magic. They are electrically different because they negotiate with different ions, according to different rules, and these rules were shaped by what each tissue must perform on time. This leads us to an idea that seems abstract until you stay with it long enough, and then it becomes almost obvious. A difference in concentration can become a difference in voltage when the membrane chooses a side. In physical chemistry, this is reflected in what is often called the Nernst equation. named after Walther Nernst, who worked in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, describing the balance of chemical and electrical forces. You don't need the equation to feel the meaning. If a membrane is permeable primarily to one type of ion, and there is more of that ion on one side than the other, the ion will tend to move down its concentration gradient. But as it moves, it carries a charge. This movement of charge changes the electrical difference across the membrane, and this electrical difference begins to oppose further movement. Eventually, a balance point is reached where the chemical desire to spread out is exactly balanced by the electrical desire to resist further charge separation. This balance point is the equilibrium potential for that ion under those conditions. The membrane has, in effect, converted a chemical imbalance into a measurable electrical potential. The key phrase here is when the membrane chooses a side. The selectivity of the membrane determines which ion dominates this balance. Change the selectivity and the equilibrium voltage shifts. Change the concentrations and the equilibrium voltage shifts. Thus, voltage is not a mysterious fluid. It is the physical bookkeeping of forces that arise when charged particles are distributed unevenly, and then selectively allowed to negotiate at a boundary. Once you see voltage as bookkeeping, it becomes clear why it is not a decorative feature of cells, a byproduct, or a curious object for machines to measure. It is a control variable. In many biological systems, voltage does not just reflect what is happening. It helps decide what happens next. Some channels open or close depending on the voltage across the membrane, which means that voltage becomes part of the causal chain. In a muscle cell, voltage changes can trigger a sequence, leading to contraction with the release of calcium, and the interaction of actin and myosin, creating the force that moves bone and blood. In secretory cells, voltage changes can influence whether vesicles fuse and release hormones or neurotransmitters. In sensory cells, voltage changes can translate light, pressure, or chemicals into electrical signals that the nervous system is capable of interpreting. In developing tissues, voltage states can influence cell behavior in ways that are still being actively studied, but which suggest that electrical conditions participate in decisions about growth and organization. In all of this, there is no need for drama. This is simply how excitable living matter manages time. A chemical reaction might be too slow, to diffuse, to easily lost in a crowd of molecules. Voltage can provide a fast, reversible threshold, an on-off condition that can coordinate events with a precision that chemistry alone would struggle to maintain in an open aqueous environment. This is why voltage is not just measured, it is used. It is a way to make biology punctual. Behind this abstraction lies a sensory reality, and it is useful to remember it. Otherwise the subject can become too sterile, too much like chalk on a board, too distant from the body in which you live. In every moment of your life, countless microscopic boundaries are being guarded. Your tissues are built of tightly packed cells, and each cell maintains its internal conditions in an environment that would erase them. If the boundary fell, gradients are not rare, and they are not an exclusive feature of nerves. They exist in the skin, in the lining of the gut, in the kidney tubules, in immune cells everywhere. That living matter has to decide what to let in and what to keep out. This guarding is not passive. It requires continuous work because membranes are not airtight, and because life depends on controlled leakage. The organism tolerates and even relies on certain flows, but it does not allow those flows to become uncontrolled. Thus, there is a constant tension between permeability and protection, between openness and order. If you ever want to find a humble image of what it means to be alive, you wouldn't go wrong imagining a billion tiny shorelines, each preserving its differences from the sea, each spending energy to remain unlike its environment. We rarely feel this directly, and perhaps we should be grateful for that, or else life would be too noisy. But the consequences of this guarding catch up with us in every movement, every breath, every moment of waking and sleep. The readiness you take for granted is built on separations you never notice. And this quietly returns us to what life does with energy at its most fundamental level. Life does not just consume fuel, it invests in separation. And this separation becomes a quiet source of readiness. Food, oxygen, and metabolism are not the story in themselves. They are merely the way to pay, allowing the cell to keep differences intact, to maintain gradients, and to use voltage as a working variable without letting everything slide into uniformity. Readiness is not free, it is constructed. The body prefers to spend energy not only on immediate action, but on the invisible infrastructure that makes action possible at the right moment. There is a patient intelligence in this, not an intelligence with intentions, but an intelligence in the sense of a system shaped for survival in unpredictability through constant preparation. A membrane holding back oceans of charge is not a metaphor for willpower or discipline. It is a physical fact repeated on such a small scale that it becomes almost philosophical. It suggests that much of life is the art of maintaining boundaries, without becoming isolated, letting in what is necessary, without surrendering the conditions that make you you. And once you begin to perceive membranes as cliff edges, you begin to notice how much of what we call behavior is built on timing, and how much of timing is built on voltage. Once you see membranes as cliff edges, the next question becomes psychological in a deeper sense. What does the brain do with a currency made of timing? You are doing nothing heroic. You are simply looking at a doorway, listening to a phrase, picking up a cup, and inside your skull is an organ weighing a small fraction of your body, quietly consuming a disproportionate part of what you eat and breathe. The question is not whether the brain uses energy. All living things do. The question is why it requires so much if neural electricity, as we have found, is not the primary source of energy in the sense that a flame is. If the brain is not a battery pushing raw electricity out, why does it demand such a generous budget? Why is the price so high for what often looks from the outside like stillness? A person can sit still and think, the body barely moves, and yet the metabolic load persists. The evidence suggests that the answer is not that thinking is a loud electrical firework display. The answer is that the brain is an organ designed to maintain timing reliability in an environment where reliability is hard won, and most of its spending goes toward maintaining the conditions under which signals can arise on time, every time, without turning into noise. One way to approach this without mythology is to abandon the image of a single spark containing an idea. This is tempting because it matches how we perceive thoughts as something discrete, but it does not match what the nervous system actually does. Neural coding, as far as modern neuroscience can tell, is largely distributed. Information is carried in patterns across populations of neurons, using timing, frequency, and probabilities, rather than a single privileged impulse that carries meaning in and of itself. In practical terms, this means that perception and intention are usually the product not of one fired neuron, but of many neurons firing with specific temporal relationships. Connections matter. Milliseconds matter. Synchrony and sequence matter. And because the brain is built not of crisp metal tracks, but of living tissue bathed in electrolytes, the problem becomes obvious. The brain must create timing in a world that wants to blur that timing. Heat shakes molecules. Random channel openings occur. The chemical environment fluctuates. Sepses vary. Even the same neuron can behave slightly differently from moment to moment, depending on its recent activity and local conditions. In such a system, a code based on population timing is both powerful and fragile. Powerful because it can represent subtle structures. Fragile because subtle structures are easily destroyed. The brain's energy demand begins to make sense when you see it as the price of maintaining a probabilistic distributed code in a state of sufficient stability to be trusted for survival. Here, a less glamorous truth sets in. Most of the brain's energy expenditure is not spent on dramatic moments you might notice, like a surge of activity during sudden fear. It is spent on stability itself. The brain must constantly maintain ionic conditions in neurons and glia, so that signals can be generated with predictable thresholds and recovery. It must restore gradients after activity, not because the signal exhausts energy as it moves, but because every event slightly disrupts the carefully maintained separations that make the next event possible. This is less like burning fuel for a single action and more like paying for infrastructure. Imagine a city that pays not so much for every car trip, but for the constant work of keeping the roads paved, the traffic lights working, the signals synchronized, and the emergency systems ready. Most of these costs are invisible until something fails. In the brain, the equivalent is the continuous work that keeps membranes in the right state, supplies synapses, recycles neurotransmitters, and buffers the local environment. Even when you are not consciously focused, the brain maintains readiness. It holds itself near working conditions, and the word near is key here. Too far from the threshold, and signals become sluggish or impossible. Too close, and noise becomes activity, and activity turns into instability. The brain's spending is the price of staying in that narrow band, where time can be used as a reliable currency. Reliability is expensive, because biology cannot rely on the pure determinism available to engineering circuits. Metal wires do not change their properties because they were recently used. Silicon gates do not tire of yesterday's arguments. But neurons exist in a living environment, and the living environment is variable. This is why the brain uses redundancy. It repeats, averages, distributes. One synapse may fail, and the system continues to work. One neuron may be noisy, and the population will still carry the signal. This redundancy is not wasteful in an evolutionary sense. It is a reliability strategy in wet matter. But redundancy comes with costs, because every additional component must be maintained, and every maintained component has gradients to preserve, neurotransmitters to cycle, and membranes to hold within a working range. Even the wires themselves are metabolically costly. Axons and dendrites have surface area, and surface area is where ionic work happens. Synapses are tiny but numerous, and each is a site of continuous renewal and regulation. To frame a simple phrase as close to the facts as possible, the brain pays for reliability with constant maintenance. It spends energy to prevent the world's natural tendency toward noise from becoming the default state of mind. The link between attention and energy becomes clear if we consider that wakefulness is not just a psychological state. It is also a physiological posture regulated by systems that change the brain's readiness to process information and respond. Activation networks in the brainstem and basal forebrain, using neuromodulators norepinephrine, acetylcholine, serotonin, dopamine, and histamine shift the balance of neural responsiveness, the signal-to-noise ratio, and the stability of network states. These systems do not carry detailed sensory content as visual or auditory pathways do. Instead, they adjust the overall operating mode. They make the cortex more receptive, more selective, more capable of sustaining some patterns and suppressing others. Attention, in this view, is partly the brain spending energy to narrow the field of possibilities, to prioritize the temporal connections that matter right now, and to suppress those that do not. This is why fatigue feels like more than just tired muscles. It can feel like a loss of precision. The world becomes slightly blurred. Decisions take longer. The brain is still active, but the tuning systems no longer hold the same posture. The facts suggest that being awake is not just being conscious. It is the nervous system maintaining a specific electrical and chemical configuration that supports rapid and reliable coding. This configuration costs energy not just in the form of impulses, but in the form of background work holding the circuits in a state of readiness and selectivity. And here we reach a boundary where good science becomes humble, because measurement becomes easier than understanding meaning. We can record impulses. We can build maps. We can model how populations encode variables, how rhythms organize communication between regions, how neuromodulators alter gain and stability. We can do all this and still not be able to translate a pattern of activity into the felt texture of experience with any satisfying completeness. The relationship between neural activity and consciousness remains an open frontier, and the honest position is to acknowledge this without embarrassment. We do not know for certain how subjective experience arises from physical processes, or whether it is better understood as an emergent property, a special kind of information integration, a global workspace, or something else that current theories only approximate. But the facts speak of something deep enough already, even without solving the hard problem. Whatever experience is, it depends on timing. It depends on coordination in a distributed fabric. It depends on maintaining the conditions that allow this timing to be reliable enough to build a stable world inside the skull. Even if the deepest translation remains unknown, the infrastructure supporting it is visible, measurable, and expensive. Thus, the brain's appetite begins to look not like greed, but like responsibility. It pays not so much for the fireworks of thought as you feel it. It pays for the quiet order that makes thought possible in a system that would otherwise slide into error. Your thoughts ride on a system designed for punctuality, and the price is paid in silence long before you notice the bill. If the brain's electricity is paid for by maintenance, we must meet the worker who endlessly performs this maintenance in every cell. Imagine this. The true engine of your electricity is not a flash, not a dramatic discharge, not a spark that makes the room momentarily bright, but a labor repeating the same movement so many times that the number ceases to seem like a number. It works in silence. It does not change its mind. It does not celebrate a good day. It just pushes and pulls again and again, keeping the internal environment of cells different from the external, maintaining a separation that would otherwise vanish. If you could watch a single cell long enough, you would be tempted to say that nothing is happening because the cell boundary seems motionless. But that stillness is bought. The boundary holds because something is constantly repairing it. Life often looks calm on the surface because it spends energy maintaining that calmness. And in the nervous system, where timing is everything, this spending becomes almost obsessive. The hidden truth is that much of what we call bioelectricity is not a natural background gift that cells simply possess. It is an organization that must be paid for with continuous molecular labor. It is easy to say the name and forget what it means. It means that the cell has a machine that uses the chemical energy of ATP to move ions against their gradients, exporting sodium and importing potassium in a fixed ratio. Usually 3 sodium ions out for every 2 potassium ions in. The details matter because they show why this is not just transport, but electrical bookkeeping. By pumping out more positive charge than it brings in, the pump makes a direct contribution to the electrical difference across the membrane, and by maintaining the fundamental concentration gradients of sodium and potassium, it preserves the conditions that make excitability possible at all. We do not know for sure what the first researchers felt when this mechanism became clear, but the data suggests it was part of a broader shift in 20th century physiology. The recognition that the membrane is not a passive bag, but an active boundary filled with machinery. The pump is not a metaphorical worker. It is literally a molecular machine undergoing conformational changes as it binds ions, hydrolyzes ATP, and releases ions on the opposite side. The fact that such a machine exists is enough in itself to change your view of life. It means that a cell spends its fuel not just on growth or movement, but on maintaining an internal geography of ions, a chemical map that makes electrical order possible. Why is this so important for excitability? Because a nerve impulse, a muscle contraction, the precise release of a neurotransmitter, all of this depends on the existence of a resting state that can be disturbed and then restored. In excitable cells, sodium and potassium gradients are not just decorative differences. They are the substrates from which action potentials borrow. When a neuron depolarizes, it does not invent voltage. It spends a small fraction of the accumulated imbalance, allowing sodium to enter and, later, allowing potassium to exit in ways that create a momentary signal. After the signal, the system must return to a state of readiness. If gradients were allowed to drift toward equilibrium, The membrane would lose its ability to produce sharp changes in voltage. Thresholds would blur. Impulses would not rise. Communication would become unreliable and then impossible altogether. This is why the pump is not a background detail. It is the long-term guarantor of excitability. Without it, the membrane potential collapses toward zero. Ion concentrations begin to level out, and the very concept of a nerve impulse loses its meaning. Tissue failure does not always begin dramatically. Often it starts with a loss of precision. Signals become sluggish. Muscles weaken. Sepsis fail. Then, as conditions worsen, cells swell. Membranes depolarize irreversibly, and the system moves into a state of dysfunction that is difficult to fix. Thus, the pump is not only a maintenance mechanism, it is the boundary between the organized life of a tissue and the undifferentiated chemistry that would follow if the boundary were not actively maintained. There is another quiet truth that the pump makes obvious. Living membranes are never perfectly airtight. They cannot be, and they should not be. If a membrane were perfectly airtight, it would lock the cell in a static state, depriving it of the ability to exchange materials or respond to changes. Instead, membranes are semi-permeable, and this semi-permeability includes what physiologists call leak channels. These are pathways that allow ions to drift across the membrane even at rest, contributing to the resting potential and to the constant need for correction. Leakage is not an error. It is part of how membranes maintain a flexible readiness. But leakage creates a problem that must be solved continuously. If potassium leaks out and sodium seeps in, then over time, without active transport, the gradients will dissipate. The cell will turn into a bag of salt water indistinguishable from its surroundings. Therefore, the pump acts as a counterweight, constantly correcting this drift. Thus, life appears as a balance between controlled permeability and active correction. The membrane is allowed to breathe ions to stay responsive, but this responsiveness requires the constant restoration of the very gradients it consumes. This is the reason why the battery metaphor is both useful and incomplete. A battery in a desk drawer preserves its charge for a long time. A living cell preserves its charge by working for it. Its voltage is not a stored object, but a maintained state. The energy cost of this maintenance is considerable. In many types of cells, a significant portion of ATP production goes toward maintaining ion gradients, and in nervous tissue, where the surface area of membranes is vast and firings are frequent, this proportion becomes even larger. The brain's energy budget, therefore, is spent not so much on conscious thought as some kind of glowing experience. It is spent on restoring ionic order after electrical activity, and on correcting the continuous leakage that would otherwise undermine readiness. This is why the phrase hidden electricity bill is not just a poetic turn of phrase. It is a literal calculation. The pump consumes ATP. ATP must be produced through metabolism. Metabolism requires oxygen and substrates. In the brain, where a cessation of oxygen supply can cause rapid dysfunction, the connection becomes obvious. The nervous system is fragile not because it is mystical. It is fragile because it is expensive and fast. It operates at the edge of constraints. It requires a continuous supply of energy not for the sake of a spectacle, but for the sake of maintaining life. Even when you are doing almost nothing, your neurons and supporting glial cells are toiling to keep gradients intact. They maintain a charged architecture that allows the next impulse, the next perception, the next movement to occur with the right timing. The bill is paid in the background, and you only notice it when the payment fails. One of the most instructive things in physiology is that systems reveal themselves when they break. And here, poisons and hypoxia become grim teachers. Certain toxins, such as cardiac glycosides e.g., orbain, can inhibit the sodium-potassium pump by binding to it and preventing its normal cycle. In controlled experiments, this allows researchers to observe what happens when the pump's correction vanishes. Gradients begin to drift. Membrane potentials change. Excitability disappears. In living organisms, an interruption of oxygen supply can lead to similar results through a different path. If the oxygen supply is insufficient, ATP production falls, as oxidative phosphorylation in the mitochondria slows or stops. Without enough ATP, the pump cannot function. When pump activity decreases, ion gradients begin to collapse. Sodium accumulates inside cells, pulling water with it, which leads to swelling. Calcium regulation fails, triggering cascades that can damage enzymes and membranes. Electrical order turns into electrical disorder, not because electricity has become evil, but because the system that maintained the gradients is no longer paying for them. In the brain, this sequence can unfold with frightening speed. Within a few minutes of severe hypoxia, neurons begin to depolarize, synaptic transmission ceases, and if the oxygen supply is not restored, irreversible damage can occur. The facts suggest that what we call loss of consciousness or blackouts is, at the cellular level, an energy crisis that rapidly escalates into an ionic crisis and then into structural damage. It is a chain that begins with an inability to maintain gradients, the silent framework of electrical life. There is something sobering in this, but it should not be frightening. It can bring clarity. Electricity in biology is not a free gift of nature. It is a paid-for structure, being built and rebuilt anew, like a roof under a constant wind. From below, the roof seems stable, and you may never think about the nails, the beams, the repairs, or how the weather is eternally trying to tear it off. And yet, stability is not a natural default state. It is work. The sodium-potassium pump is one of the primary workers of this stability, and its existence underscores a larger truth about life itself. Life survives by maintaining differences in a universe that prefers sameness. It maintains these differences not with wishes, but with the disciplined expenditure of energy. The body constantly invests in the separations that allow it to act quickly when necessary. These investments create readiness, and readiness is what most of us experience as being alive without thinking about it. When you lift your arm, you do not feel the work of the pump, you feel the intention. But intention rides on the back of infrastructure, and infrastructure is maintained by countless molecular machines performing the same work. Without change, a labor that will never become a plot point, but which makes any plot possible. From microscopic labors, we move to the first organ that taught people to see electricity as a rhythm that can almost be heard. You place your fingers on your wrist and feel a steady tapping that seems almost childlike in its simplicity, like a drum that never learned any other song. This can make one perceive the heart as a mechanical object, a pump that simply turns on and keeps working. But the deeper you look, the less sense this picture makes. The physics underlying the heartbeat is closer to choreography than to pumping, because the pump only works if the timing is correct, and this timing is not a conscious decision. It is a moving electrical order traveling through muscle tissue in a prescribed sequence, like a wave that knows where it needs to go next. The sound and the pulse are the results. You notice the part that the ribcage translates into sensations. The cause begins earlier and voltage changes invisible to you, but reliable enough that you can build an entire life on them without needing to understand them. We do not know for certain what it meant for ancient people to feel a pulse and link it to life itself, but we can say with certainty that the pulse has always been one of the body's most intimate and yet public signals. It can be touched. It can be counted. One can observe how it changes under the influence of fear, exertion, hunger, and sleep. It is one of the few deep processes that the body allows the hand to witness directly, and this is partly why it seems simple. The hand feels the result, not the choreography that makes that result possible. The turning point is to state the quiet truth directly. The heart is primarily an electrical organ, and only secondarily a mechanical pump. Its mechanical work depends entirely on electrical coordination. The heart creates force through muscular contraction, but it only creates useful force when that contraction occurs in the correct order. The chambers should not all squeeze at once, like a fist. Blood must move directionally. Valves must open and close sequentially. The atria must fill the ventricles. The ventricles must eject blood into the arteries. All of this requires timing precision measured in fractions of a second. The evidence suggests that the heart achieves this precision through specialized cardiac cells that possess excitability and are interconnected, allowing depolarization to spread through the tissue like a wave. The wave is not an optional decoration. It is the organizer. Without it, the muscle might still twitch, but that twitching would not provide circulation. The heart's reliability is due to the existence of planned pathways that guide excitation through the myocardium, guaranteeing the coordination of contraction in a three-dimensional structure that must repeat its work tens of millions of times over a human life. At the peak of this choreography is a small patch of tissue known as the sinoatrial saw node. It is often called the natural pacemaker, and while that phrase is accurate, it can hide the mechanism behind a comforting blur. The cells of the saw node possess electrophysiologic properties that allow them to depolarize spontaneously. They do not need an external command to initiate each beat. Their membrane potentials drift toward the threshold due to specific ionic currents, including the so-called funny currents and calcium currents, which create a slow diastolic depolarization. In simple terms, these cells are designed to be slightly unstable in a controlled manner. They slowly climb toward firing. Then they fire, reset, and begin the climb again. This makes the heart self-starting. The rhythm is not created by willpower, it is created by cellular inclination. The organism can modulate it through autonomic influence, speeding it up with sympathetic stimulation, or slowing it down via parasympathetic impact, but the basic generation of impulses stems from the properties of the pacemaker cells themselves. The facts suggest that having a self-initiating rhythm provides resilience. It means the heart does not need a central command to keep working. It carries the seed of its own timing within its tissue. From the saw node, the wave of depolarization spreads across the atria. An atrial contraction follows, pushing blood into the ventricles. But the heart is not just a bag of muscle fibers. It is a structured organ with insulation and channels and intentional delays built into the system. The electrical signal reaches the atrioventricular node, where conduction slows down. This pause is not a defect, it is a purpose. It gives the ventricles time to fill before they contract. From there, the signal travels down the bundle of His and Purkinje fiber specialized conducting pathways that rapidly distribute the depolarization throughout the ventricular tissue. This ensures that the ventricles contract in a coordinated, efficient pattern, squeezing from the apex upward in a way that blood is ejected into the arteries with maximum efficiency. The beauty of this, if we may carefully use that word in a scientific context, is that it makes the heart simultaneously simple and precise. Simple because the pattern repeats, precise because it must repeat with enough fidelity to keep oxygen delivery stable under changing conditions. A planned pathway is a biological solution to a physical problem: how to synchronize contraction in a thick, branching muscle mass so that it behaves as a single unit rather than a collection of independent fibers. When physiologists talk about wave propagation in the heart, they are describing a phenomenon that can be studied as a dynamic system. Depolarization spreads because heart cells are connected by gap junctions, allowing ions to move between cells, forcing neighboring membranes to reach the threshold and fire. The heart is thus an excitable medium, a tissue capable of supporting traveling waves. In such media, waves can take complex forms. One form, under certain conditions, is a spiral wave. The behavior of spiral waves has been observed in models of cardiac tissue and is significant for understanding certain arrhythmias. A spiral wave can rotate around a core, reactivating the tissue in a circle and creating sustained abnormal rhythms. This is not a poetic image, it is a mathematical and physiological reality. The same rules that allow a wave to move forward can, under certain disruptions, cause it to loop. This is why the reliability of the heart lies not only in generating a beat, but in maintaining the correct path of excitation. We do not know for sure how many microfactors influence this transition in a specific person, at a specific moment, as the heart is a living organ with variations in tissue properties, conduction velocity, refractory periods, and autonomic tone, but the facts suggest that the conceptual model of wave propagation and re-entry explains why some rhythm disturbances persist until they are interrupted, and why certain interventions work by resetting the electrical state rather than by adding force. The sensory fact remains unchanged. You do not feel voltage, you feel muscle work. A heartbeat is an electrical event translated into mechanical action, then into pressure waves in the blood, then into sensations in the chest, wrist, and throat. The thud you feel is the mechanical consequence of coordinated contraction. The pulse at the wrist is a pressure wave traveling through the arteries, expanding and contracting the vessel walls. However, the primary cause is electrical. A small sequence of ion movements in the SAR node initiates the wave that coordinates billions of muscle cells, and coordinated contraction becomes circulation, and circulation becomes the stable delivery of oxygen that allows your brain to continue its own games with time. When you feel a beat, you feel the end of a chain that begins at membrane thresholds. This is one of the reasons why the heart has always attracted metaphors and myths. It is the place where the invisible becomes tangible. You cannot place your hand on your liver and count its work, but you can place your hand on your wrist and count your heart. The body offers this as proof that you are still here. Modern clinical practice has added another layer to this story by finding a way to reconstruct the hidden electrical order from the surface of the body. The electrocardiogram is one of the most elegant compromises in medicine. It does not see the heart directly, but it sees the field changes created by the heart's depolarization and repolarization as they spread through the tissues. Electrodes placed on the skin measure voltage differences, reflecting the total electrical activity of the heart. The interpretation of this data is non-trivial, but the principle is simple and almost merciful. Without incisions, without imaging, without touching the heart itself, one can infer its electrical choreography. The P wave, the Cus complex, the T wave. These shapes correspond to the phases of atrial depolarization, ventricular depolarization, and ventricular repolarization. This is a clinical window. Surface measurements can reveal internal timing because electrical activity creates fields that extend beyond the organ. The facts suggest that this technology changed medicine by making the heart's rhythm readable. It turned an organ previously judged mainly by pulse and stethoscope into an organ whose electrical language can be recorded, archived, and compared over time. Thus, the heartbeat stops being a simple knock and becomes a constantly renewing wave, and life depends on that wave not losing its way. This is the quiet truth at the center of it all. The heart's work is repeatable, but it is not mindless, it is structured. Because the rhythm is both intimate and measurable, it becomes one of the few places where the body's electrical life can be felt as a sensation and observed as data. You can feel it, and you can plot it. In a sense, this makes the heart a bridge between the private world of cellular gradients and the public world of counts and diagnoses. It is also the reason why the heart, more than many other organs, invites late-night reflection. The beat is always there. It can be ignored most of the day, but in the silence, it becomes noticeable, a reminder that your body maintains order without asking you. And once you notice it, the mind is tempted to wonder, what happens when this changes? As soon as the rhythm becomes visible, the human mind does what it always does at night. It begins to fear what will happen when the rhythm breaks. The beat in the chest falters for a moment, and the mind does something primitive and fast. It does not interpret this as a minor mechanical glitch, like a snapped shoelace. It interprets it as an event full of meaning. An irregular heartbeat can feel like a philosophical interruption, as if the body has momentarily questioned its contract with you, a contract that says you will stay here and you do not need to manage the equipment. The pulse is one of the few internal processes that announces itself clearly enough for a person to notice a deviation, and this attention carries special weight. You can ignore digestion, you can ignore kidney filtration, but you cannot easily ignore the rhythm you feel in your own throat. When this rhythm becomes uneven, the mind seeks to fill the void with a narrative. Something is wrong. Something is failing. Something is out of control. The facts suggest that this reaction is not irrational. It is an ancient protective reflex. But it is also incomplete. Because arrhythmias often reveal not a weakness in the usual sense, not a heart running out of strength, but the emergence of alternative electrical states, patterns of coordination that are stable in their own erroneous way. The turning point here is understanding arrhythmia primarily as an electrical phenomenon. The mechanical function of the heart depends on electrical timing, and timing systems can fail not only by stopping, but by choosing another pattern. In excitable tissues, there are several ways for waves to spread. Under normal conditions, conduction follows a path that ensures orderly contraction. Under certain conditions, conduction can slow down, be blocked, change route, or loop re-entry, creating rhythms that are too fast, too slow, irregular, or inefficient. What is striking is that the tissue can lock into these patterns and maintain them. In the language of dynamic systems, they can become stable states. We do not know for certain why a specific person experiences a specific arrhythmia at a specific moment, because the causes can be multi-layered. Structural heart disease, ischemia, electrolyte imbalance, autonomic shifts, drug effects, genetic channelopathies, scarring, inflammation. But the facts point to a general truth, both unsettling and clarifying. Biological electricity can fall into erroneous coordination, and once it happens, it can persist until something interrupts it. This is why some arrhythmias cease on their own, while others do not. It is not always a matter of the heart's weakness. Often, it is a matter of the heart being stuck in a different electrical solution. A useful way to organize this topic without drowning in clinical details is to distinguish between problems of rate and problems of conduction. They overlap, but this distinction helps the mind. Problems of rate are related to the speed of impulse generation. The rhythm can be too fast, tachycardia, or too slow, bradycardia. Sometimes this reflects changes in the activity of the sinoatrial node pacemaker. Under the influence of autonomic tone, medications, fever, thyroid hormones, or internal diseases of the node, sometimes the pacemaker is suppressed by an ectopic focuser patch of tissue that fires prematurely. Problems of conduction are related to how impulses move through the heart. An impulse may be generated normally, but not spread properly. Blocks can occur in the atrioventricular node, or in the bundle branches, delaying or preventing ventricular activation. Conduction can also become non-uniform, where different areas conduct the signal at different speeds, creating conditions for the fragmentation or looping of wave fronts. Many clinically important arrhythmias contain both elements. For example, a re-entry circuit is a conduction phenomenon that creates a high rate. Atrial fibrillation involves chaotic conduction patterns that create an irregular ventricular response. But this scheme remains useful. It reminds us that the heart's rhythm can go wrong either because the initial signal is incorrect, or because the path of that signal is incorrect. The concept of re-entry is one of the clearest examples of erroneous coordination that does not require the exhaustion of the heart. In simplified form, a wave of excitation normally moves forward through the tissue. Then the tissue temporarily becomes refractory, unable to fire again immediately. This prevents the wave from turning back and reactivating the same region. But if there is a path where conduction is slow enough, and refractory periods are distributed in a specific way, the wave can circle back and return to tissue that has already recovered, re-exciting it and sustaining the loop. This can happen on an anatomical obstacle, such as scar tissue, or on a functional obstacle created by non-uniform refractoriness. The wave does not end. It keeps circling. As a result, the rhythm is maintained not by the steady choice of the pacemaker, but by the geometry and timing within the tissue. In more complex cases, multiple waves and rotors can exist, especially in fibrillation, where electrical activity becomes disorganized, leading to irregular contraction and reduced pump efficiency. We do not know for certain how to predict every transition from a normal rhythm to re-entry in every person. but the facts speak to the reliability of the principles themselves. Re-entry is the behavior of the heart as an excitable medium that has found a self-sustaining pattern. It is coordination that is locally stable but globally harmful. The body perceives this not as an abstract pattern, but through consequences. A heart rate that is too fast or too irregular can reduce the efficiency of filling and ejection, lowering blood pressure. Low pressure reduces blood flow to the brain. Changes in blood flow can alter consciousness in subtle ways, from lightheadedness to fainting. Irregular rhythms can create sensations of fluttering, thumping, or skipping. A person may feel short of breath not because the lungs have failed, but because circulation is not delivering oxygen at a stable pressure. The autonomic nervous system responds with stress signals, which can amplify perception and anxiety. In some cases, sensations are minimal, and the arrhythmia is discovered by chance. In others, the sensations are immediate and frightening. This is the body's perception of its own electrical failure, not directly as voltage, but as pressure, breath, and the edge of consciousness. It is the mind noticing that the invisible infrastructure of coordination is misbehaving. This is why the experience can feel existential. It is not that the person is overreacting. It is that the symptom touches the boundary between unconscious control and conscious vulnerability. It reminds you, without asking, that your continued presence depends on rhythms you do not command. Modern interventions reveal something quiet and profound in the logic of the heart. Often these are electrical negotiations, rather than crude mechanical fixes. Defibrillation, for example, is not a way to jumpstart a stopped heart in the cinematic sense most people imagine. In many contexts, it is a way to interrupt chaotic electrical activity, such as ventricular fibrillation, by delivering a shock that simultaneously depolarizes a critical mass of the myocardium. The goal is to reset the system, erase re-entry patterns, and allow the sinoatrial node or another organized pacemaker to restore a coordinated rhythm. Pacing is another negotiation. A pacemaker does not make the heart strong. It provides reliable timing when the heart's own timing or conduction is insufficient, ensuring that impulses are at a safe rate. And in more advanced devices, it forces the chambers to contract in unison. Ablation is perhaps the most surgical form of electrical logic. By identifying the tissue involved in the arrhythmia circuit and destroying or isolating it with heat or cold, doctors can eliminate the path that sustains the erroneous coordination. Each of these interventions implies the same underlying truth. Arrhythmias are often problems of pattern, and a pattern can be changed by resetting, overriding, or reshaping the tissue's conduction paths. We do not know for certain how future technologies will refine these negotiations, but the facts suggest the general approach will remain the same. Understand the electrical map, and then intervene with high precision. There is a psychological dimension that deserves respect without sliding into superstition. Fear is understandable because the feeling of a rhythm disturbance is close to the feeling of life's uncertainty. But science is clearer than feelings, and clarity reduces superstition. When people fear arrhythmia, they often imagine a single scenario of inevitable decline. However, many rhythm disturbances are benign, many are curable, and many are manageable through medication, lifestyle changes, or procedures. Some are dangerous and require emergency care, and that is exactly why clarity matters, as it allows for an adequate response rather than panic. It also helps to remember that the heart's electrical behavior follows rules. It is not punishing you. It is not sending messages from the universe. It is responding to tissue properties, ion channels, autonomic influences, and structural conditions. Understanding these conditions does not eliminate fear, but it can define its boundaries. It can turn vague anxiety into a specific question. What is this rhythm? What mechanism sustains it? What intervention would be appropriate? The transition from terror to a question is one of the most human applications of science, especially at night. Many of our deepest bodily anxieties are not about death as an abstraction, but about the failure of coordination in a system we cannot consciously control. This is a quiet lesson that arrhythmias teach, and it concerns more than just the heart. We live inside a body that is constantly coordinating itself. Most of the time, this coordination is so seamless that we forget it exists. When it stumbles, even briefly, we are reminded that control never truly belonged to us. We were passengers in a system that requires meticulous maintenance, and we only notice that maintenance when it fails. And yet, it is also true that this system is not arbitrary. It is comprehensible. It can be measured. It can often be fixed. This is not comfort in a sentimental sense. It is comfort in the sense that reality is subject to patterns, not inhabited by ghosts. The heartbeat is intimate, and therefore its disruptions feel intimate. But the mechanisms are physical, and because they are physical, they can be understood and acted upon. This understanding does not cancel mortality. It simply removes unnecessary darkness from the places where it does not belong. The heart taught us to perceive voltage as rhythm, but the brain invites a stranger reading. Voltage here is a landscape shaped by sleep. You fall asleep, and the world goes quiet. The sharp edges of your thoughts blur, and the sense of being you recedes to a soft distance. From the inside, it feels like fading away. From the outside, it feels like the body has switched off. And yet, if you place electrodes on the scalp and look at what the brain's electrical activity turns into, the surprise is almost stubborn. The signal does not turn into a flat line. It becomes more structured. It becomes slower, wider, more synchronous, as if the brain is building an architecture out of time while you are gone. This is a strange question at the entrance to sleep science. If consciousness fades, why does the brain's electricity become more structured? Why does the loss of experience coincide with the appearance of rhythms that are large enough to be seen from the surface of the head? We do not know for certain how subjective awareness and large-scale synchronization are linked, because consciousness remains one of the most difficult frontiers in biology. But the facts suggest that sleep is not a shutdown. It is a change of mode, an organized alteration of the electrical order. And this organization itself seems to be linked to maintenance, memory, and a quiet grooming that prevents the living nervous system from breaking down under the weight of its own daily use. The instrument that first made this visible to human eyes is the electroencephalogram, or EEG technique, with roots reaching back to the early 20th century. The EEG is often mistaken for a direct reading of thoughts, a kind of window into private content. It is not. It is a surface measurement that captures the aggregate electrical consequences of many neurons acting together, especially in the cortex. It sees synchrony in populations best, because synchrony creates a field large enough to pass through tissue and skull to reach the electrodes. Simply put, the EEG primarily reflects the coordinated postsynaptic potentials of large groups of cortical, pyramidal neurons, aligned so that their tiny voltage changes sum up, rather than cancel each other out. This is why deep structures, such as the hippocampus, are harder to read directly with scalp EEG, and why localized, unsynchronized activity can be effectively invisible. Consequently, the EEG is not a microscope. It is more like a meteorological map. It does not tell you what every molecule is doing. It tells you when the atmosphere has aligned into a storm. Sleep, in this sense, is a storm of coordination. When wakefulness gives way to non-rapid eye movements and REM sleep, the cortex begins to reproduce rhythms that are not just slowed-down versions of daytime activity, but distinct large-scale patterns with their own signatures. These patterns are not random rest. They carry structure, and that structure is the key to the puzzle. One of the defining features of deep slow-wave sleep is the presence of slow waves, high-amplitude oscillations that sweep across the cortex. These waves are often discussed alongside delta activity. In precise research, these terms can be separated, but the core idea is the same. The cortex begins to alternate between states where many neurons are more excitable, and states where they are less excitable, creating a rhythm measurable over broad areas. Researchers sometimes describe these alternations as up states, activation states, and down states, inhibition states, not as metaphors, but as physiological shifts in membrane potential and firing probability in populations. During deep sleep, the cortex turns into a landscape of coordinated on and off tendencies, with these transitions moving and sometimes organizing into fronts, traveling through different regions. Alongside slow waves, sleep spindles appear short bursts of oscillatory activity in a higher frequency range, usually around 12-15 Hz, associated with thalamocortical interactions. They are believed to reflect a process of filtering and coordination between the thalamus and the cortex. Then follows the phase of rapid eye movement REM sleep, which looks different again on the EEG. It often becomes low amplitude and more desynchronized, resembling wakefulness in some aspects. Although muscle tone is actively suppressed and vivid dreams may occur, these are not cosmetic differences. They suggest that the brain cycles through different electrical modes, each with its own characteristic synchronization pattern, each imposing its own constraints on information flow, and each linked to distinct physiological processes that go beyond simple rest. The question arises, what are these rhythms for? And here the evidence is compelling, though incomplete, as it should be in honest science. The main line of research suggests that sleep rhythms are involved in memory processes. We do not know for certain that a spindle causes memory to consolidate in the same way a hammer causes a nail to enter wood. Biology rarely obeys such clean cause and effect at the behavioral level, but the facts point to strong associations and plausible mechanisms. In both human and animal studies, activity patterns during sleep appear linked to the stabilization and transformation of memories formed during wakefulness. According to one influential view, slow-wave sleep supports the redistribution of memory traces. Hippocampal activity interacts with cortical networks to gradually strengthen long-term representations. In animals, researchers have observed replay patterns in the hippocampus. In humans, indirect measurements, invasive recordings, and clinical data point to coordinated temporal links between hippocampal events and cortical rhythms. A particularly important detail is coupling. Slow oscillations, spindles, and faster events called ripples in the hippocampus appear to align in time in a way that allows for the transfer and integration of information. The slow wave provides the general temporal structure, the framework. The spindle may coordinate thalamocortical communication and windows of plasticity, and the ripple may carry the compressed reactivation of recent experience. Even if the full story remains a subject of debate, the direction of the evidence points to sleep as a period when the brain reorganizes information, using rhythm as a tuning tool. This is not thinking in the sense that you feel it, but it may be the restructuring of the conditions under which tomorrow's thinking becomes possible. Another line of work, no less important and not exclusive of the first, suggests that sleep is a period of synaptic regulation, a kind of cleanup of connectivity itself. Wakefulness is a state of continuous learning in the broadest sense. Sensory signals, movements, decisions, and emotions, all of these change synaptic strength and network configurations. If synapses only strengthened and were never recalibrated, the system would risk saturation, excessive energy consumption, and a reduced ability to encode new information. One hypothesis, often discussed as synaptic homeostasis, suggests that sleep helps renormalize synaptic strength, preserving important changes and preventing uncontrolled amplification. The evidence here includes molecular markers, electrophysiologic measurements, and behavioral patterns indicating that some forms of synaptic strength decrease or recalibrate during sleep, especially during slow-wave rich stages. We do not know for certain how universal this process is for all types of synapses and circuits, and debates continue regarding which mechanisms dominate in different brain regions. But the idea fits into the general theme we are uncovering. The brain spends energy not just on signaling, but on maintaining a usable, reliable working range. Sleep may be one of the primary arenas where this maintenance occurs, not through simple idle time, but through a transition into an electrical mode favorable for recalibration. From this perspective, slow waves are not just a sign of rest. They are part of an active process of regulating connectivity and preventing the day's accumulated changes from destabilizing the system. Furthermore, there is a type of maintenance that looks less like memory and more like plumbing, and this is important because it links the electrical mode to metabolic reality. In the last decade, researchers have described what is often called the glymphatic system, a proposed pathway for the exchange of cerebrospinal and interstitial fluids that may facilitate the clearance of metabolic waste from the brain. Data suggests that during sleep, particularly in certain phases of REM sleep, the space between brain cells may expand and fluid exchange may increase, providing more effective clearance of solutes. One widely discussed series of rodent experiments reported accelerated clearance of certain metabolites during sleep compared to wakefulness, with the process involving astroglial water channels. We should be cautious here. Extrapolating results from rodents to humans requires restraint, and the scale and mechanisms of glymphatic flow in humans are still being actively studied and debated. But the core takeaway is hard to ignore. Sleep appears linked to shifts in hydrodynamics and metabolic support. This suggests that the electrical state, cellular cleanup, and the brain's internal environment are inextricably linked. The brain does not only need to remember, it needs to remain chemically sane. It needs to keep the extracellular environment within those limits that allow neurons to remain excitable without becoming unstable. Such maintenance does not look glamorous, but it is fundamental. EEG rhythms during sleep may be an outward sign of an internal maintenance schedule, where the brain shifts modes to allow processes that are harder to run during active wakefulness to take place. All of this leads to a quiet reimagining, both simple and unsettling. Sleep is not a brain shutdown. It is the brain changing its electrical modes to perform different work. This work includes memory reorganization, synaptic regulation, metabolic and fluid support, and the restoration of conditions disrupted by daytime activity. The brain's energy consumption during sleep does not drop to zero. It shifts. Some markers of total metabolic demand decrease compared to active wakefulness, but the system remains busy, just busy in a different configuration, with different rhythms and different priorities. The very fact that sleep debt has such profound cognitive and physiological consequences confirms this. If sleep were just the absence of wakefulness, skipping it would be inconvenient but not deeply destabilizing. Instead, prolonged sleep deprivation can lead to measurable impairments in attention, mood regulation, immune function, metabolic control, and in extreme cases, perceptual distortions. The facts suggest that sleep is not optional maintenance. It is scheduled maintenance, and when the schedule is ignored, the system keeps running, but errors accumulate within it. In this sense, the EEG is not just a diagnostic tool. It is a kind of map of how the brain chooses to spend its time when it is not occupied with the tasks of wakefulness. The rhythms of the schedule are written in voltage. Thus, realization comes quietly, requiring no more than the facts allow. In the darkness, the brain does not stop spending energy. It spends it differently, as if survival requires periodic recalibration of the same living circuit. The person you experience as yourself may vanish in sleep, but the nervous system continues to work, to reorganize, regulate, clean, reset thresholds, and maintain the conditions that will make tomorrow's timing possible. There is something humbling in this, for it says that the brain's most important labor may occur in those moments when you are least present to witness it. The mind in daytime life loves to believe it is the center of the story. Sleep reminds us, the story is older and more infrastructural. You are not just a thinker. You are a system that must periodically change electrical modes to remain whole. If sleep shows how the brain changes modes, then the next layer is even more ancient and less personal. Electricity is a formative force long before behavior appears, even before a limb exists, before a face knows where to place its symmetry, before the spine has a direction that can be traced with a finger. The living body is already making decisions about boundaries, not boundaries of skin, but boundaries of identity. This part will become the internal content, That part will become the surface. This cluster will become the left side, not a duplicate of the right. And this fold will become a mouth, not just another seam. If you linger on this early moment long enough, the question becomes almost frightening in its simplicity. How does the body decide where here ends and there begins when there is no here yet? That looks like anything. Genes matter, of course. Chemistry matters. Mechanics matters. But developmental biology is quietly expanding the map, showing that cells read more than just molecular signals. They also exist within electrical landscapes, gradients of membrane voltage and ionic flows that can act as coordinates. The evidence suggests that long before nerves connect thoughts, tissues are already using the bioelectric state as a kind of positional information, an invisible geography that helps matter agree on its contours. The turning point is not any single experiment, but the gradual accumulation of measurements that cannot be ignored. If you place sensitive electrodes or voltage-sensitive dyes on developing tissues, you discover patterns that are not random. Regions with different membrane potentials appear throughout the embryonic field. Ionic flows can systematically differ in zones that later become distinct structures. These patterns are measurable, repeatable, and linked to behaviors that matter. Cell proliferation, migration, differentiation, and the moment specific gene networks turn on or off. We do not know for certain if bioelectric gradients are always upstream of chemical signals, because development is more of a network than a chain. But the facts suggest they are part of the causal link, not just a passive reflection. In some contexts, changing the electrical states changes the developmental outcome. This is the type of result that forces a reconsideration of the fundamentals. Membrane potential is not just something excitable cells have. It is something cells use. And this logic is quiet but powerful. If cells can maintain different voltage states, and if they have channels and pumps that regulate these states, then a tissue can form a field of differences in space. These differences can then influence what the cells do next, which genes they express, how they respond to growth factors, and how they interpret the chemical environment. The tissue becomes not only a chemical neighborhood, but an electrical one. To speak of this cautiously, it is helpful to introduce the idea of patterning as something broader than genes alone. Genes encode proteins. Proteins build channels, pumps, receptors, transcription factors, and cytoskeletal elements. But gene expression is not a script that plays out in isolation. It responds to context. The electrical state can be part of this context, because membrane voltage affects the movement of ions, and ions, like calcium, can act as second messengers influencing transcription and signaling cascades. Voltage can also affect the transport of small charged molecules and the behavior of membrane proteins. In simple terms, the electrical state can change what a cell is ready to do. It can change thresholds. It can change responsiveness. It can change the balance between growth and differentiation. This does not mean that electricity replaces genetics. It means that genetics includes electricity, because genes build the ion channels and pumps that create and maintain electrical states, and these electrical states, in turn, influence gene regulation. Development becomes a dialogue between code and condition. The code builds the mechanisms. The mechanisms create the landscape. The landscape influences the next round of code activation. This is why some researchers speak of developmental bioelectricity as an additional layer of information, not as an alternative to molecular biology, but as a supplement that helps explain how large-scale structure reliably emerges from local interactions. Some of the most striking evidence comes from animals capable of regeneration, because regeneration makes the question of structure unavoidable. If you cut a flatworm planaria into pieces, each piece can regrow the missing organs, restoring a head where a head should be and a tail where a tail should be, restoring symmetry and proportions with a precision that seems almost like memory. Salamanders and axolotls can regenerate limbs, rebuilding bone, muscle, nerve, and skin in the correct order. Even in animals with less dramatic regeneration, wound healing involves coordinated cell movement and remodeling that yield structured results, rather than formless scars, at least in early stages of life. Researchers have found that bioelectric signals correlate with these processes. Following an injury, changes in membrane potential and ionic flow occur in the wound areas. Electrical gradients can form around the wound, and these changes appear linked to the activation of regenerative programs. We do not know for certain how much the success of regeneration depends on bioelectric signals, compared to biochemical gradients and immune modulation, as all these systems interact. But the facts suggest the electrical state is not accidental. It is part of how tissues coordinate large-scale repair. It is one way a collective of cells can agree on what the structure should become, even when it has been destroyed. What makes this more than just a correlation is the existence of experiments, where voltage states are intentionally altered and changes in growth outcomes are observed. In model organisms, frogs, fish, planaria, researchers can manipulate ion channels pharmacologically, genetically, or through targeted interventions, shifting the membrane potential in specific tissues. In some studies, altering bioelectric patterns led to changes in organ development, pigmentation patterns, or the placement of structures. Some experiments suggest that changing the electrical properties of a region can make cells behave as if they are in a different positional context, triggering growth programs that otherwise would not have arisen there. These results should be treated with restraint. They do not mean the human body can be safely reprogrammed with simple electrical tricks, and they do not mean voltage is a magic remote control for anatomy. Model organisms are chosen specifically because they are experimentally accessible, and because their regenerative abilities often exceed our own. The conditions used in laboratories can be extreme or artificial. Developmental stages are sensitive windows, and altering them can yield dramatic results that do not translate directly to adult human tissues. But the core takeaway remains. The electrical state is a causal factor to such a degree that when it is changed, what the tissue becomes can be changed. This is not superstition. These are measurements and interventions yielding reproducible discrepancies. Hidden in this story is a deeper continuity, one that connects the early embryo to the adult nervous system without reducing them to the same thing. The same classes of ion channels that support nerve excitability and muscle contraction also exist in many non-neural tissues. Potassium, sodium, chloride, and calcium channels and transporters are expressed throughout the body. Their distribution and regulation differ by tissue, but the molecular toolkit is the same. This means the organism uses a shared electrical vocabulary for different purposes throughout life. In neurons, this vocabulary turns into fast spikes and precise timing. In developing tissues, it can become slow gradients and stable voltage domains that persist long enough to guide the formation of structures. In regeneration, it can become wound-induced electrical changes involved in coordinating repair and restoration. The continuity is not that everything is a nerve. The continuity is that excitable membranes and ionic separation are fundamental tools with which life creates order in space and time. Once you notice this, electricity stops being a special effect of the brain and heart and becomes something more foundational, a way living matter can carry information without needing physical wires or a conscious mind. The most accurate way to say it is this: the developing body is built not only by instructions, it is built on fields of readiness. Cells exist in an environment that tells them what is probable, what is permitted, what is urgent, and what is forbidden. Chemical gradients do this. Mechanical tension does this. Contact with neighbors does this. And bioelectric gradients can do this too, providing a quiet coordinate system that cells can interpret. Electricity here is not the spectacular electricity of lightning or machines. It is the electricity of boundaries and choices. A cell that is more polarized or less polarized differs by more than just voltage. It may differ in how it moves, how it communicates, how it divides, and what fate it can accept. Where many cells share a single voltage state in a specific region, that region becomes a domain, a zone of shared readiness. The body, in this view, learns its contours partly through these domains, as if the tissue sketches itself in voltage before locking itself into form. This does not replace the gene regulatory networks that determine cell types. It adds a layer that helps these networks coordinate in space, turning local rules into global form. And this brings a quiet realization that can feel almost philosophical, without detaching from the evidence. The body is not only a chemical narrative, it is also a spatial agreement. Billions of cells must agree on where they are in relation to one another and what the whole becomes. This agreement is not spoken in words or controlled by a central planner. It emerges from interactions, and the bioelectric state appears to be one of the media that these interactions use. When we say that a tissue is structured, we usually mean that it is organized into regions with clearly defined fates and boundaries. Developmental bioelectricity suggests that some of these boundaries can be anticipated by electrical differences, and that changing these differences can, in some cases, change the boundary itself. The quiet thrill here is not that bodies are magical, but that they are holistic. They build integrity out of many small signals, and electricity is one of the ways these signals can become spatially extended, stable enough to guide collective behavior, just as the brain uses timing to create perception. A developing organism can use voltage landscapes to create form. Once electricity becomes a map, the mind naturally asks a dangerous question in a quiet voice: can tissue remember form? A piece of living tissue is damaged, cut, or disrupted, and yet, over time, it does not just heal with a rough scar. In some animals, it grows back correctly, not approximately, not just so it looks right from a distance, but with a stubborn fidelity to proportions and placement. The head returns to where it should be. The limb appears again with the right parts in the right sequence. Symmetry is restored, as if it were a rule that the tissue remembers. The question that arises from this is almost uncomfortable, because it touches upon what we usually separate. If tissue grows back correctly after injury, where is the memory of the correct shape stored when there is no mind to hold it? There is no brain in a fragment of a planarian. There is no narrative in a salamander's stump. No conscious blueprint hovers over the wound. And yet, the result can be organized. We do not know for certain how to translate the word memory into this biological context, without misleading ourselves. But facts suggest forms of persistence in living systems that behave like memory, without being conscious. The ability to return to a stable configuration after a disturbance, not because the system knows it, but because the system gravitates toward it. The turning point in this layer is the use of a framework borrowed from dynamical systems theory, applied carefully and with all due humility. In dynamical systems, an attractor is a set of states toward which a system tends to evolve a basin in a landscape of possibilities. If you imagine a marble rolling across a surface with valleys, it will stop in a valley not because it chooses to, but because the physics of the surface makes certain points more stable than others. This metaphor is not perfect for biology, because biology rearranges its own surface while rolling, and the marble might rebuild the valley, but the core idea is still useful. Some scientific models suggest that developing and regenerating tissues may have stable bioelectric states that function as attractors, patterns of membrane voltage and ion flow that self-stabilize in space, and guide cell behavior towards specific anatomical outcomes. The electrical state of the tissue, in this view, is not just an indicator, it is part of the control architecture. When an injury disturbs the system, the interconnected network of cells, channels, pumps, and signaling pathways may shift, and then roll back toward the stable pattern corresponding to the correct anatomical goal. We do not know for certain how universal this is across all organisms, but facts suggest it is plausible and supported by a growing number of experiments, where altering electrical signaling changes what the tissue restores. The experimental hints are often striking, as they are easy to misunderstand. In animals capable of regeneration, researchers have manipulated ion channels, gap junction communication, and membrane potentials, observing changes in regeneration results that went beyond simple healing speed. In some planarian studies, altering bioelectric signaling was linked to a change in the head versus tail regeneration decision, suggesting the possibility of shifting tissue structure decisions by modifying the electrical state. In amphibian and other model systems, interventions changing local voltage states have been linked to altered growth patterns, changes in organ development, and differences in wound response. The cautious interpretation is not that the voltage contains a detailed blueprint, like a miniature map with labels, but that the voltage state can tilt the system toward one stable outcome instead of another. A small shift in a control variable can push the system into a different attractor basin, where downstream gene expression and biochemical gradients reorganize accordingly. In this sense, the goal is not stored as an image, it is stored as a tendency, a stable configuration in an interconnected network. If the network is pushed hard enough, it may shift to another stable configuration, yielding a different anatomical result. It is because of such results that the concept of memory feels appropriate. It suggests that tissue carries an internal set of preferences for what it should become. These preferences can persist even if the tissue is fragmented or damaged. But we must speak of this without reducing everything solely to electricity, because biology does not tolerate simplified storytelling. The relationship between the electrical state, gene regulatory networks, and biochemical gradients is best described as entanglement rather than hierarchy. Gene regulatory networks define the protein cells can produce and the developmental programs they can execute. Biochemical gradients, including morphogens and signaling molecules, provide spatial landmarks and coordinate differentiation. Mechanical forces and extracellular matrix properties determine how cells move and how tissues fold. The bioelectric state is another layer that simultaneously influences these processes and is itself dependent on them. Ion channels and pumps are gene products. Their activity changes membrane potential. Membrane potential influences ion flows, including calcium dynamics, which affect signaling cascades and gene expression. Gap junctions provide electrical and chemical links between cells, creating tissue domains. These domains can interact with biochemical gradients, sometimes reinforcing boundaries, sometimes rearranging them. The facts suggest that none of these layers is the sole script. Development and regeneration emerge from the coupling of multiple information processes. There is also an honest boundary to keep in mind. We do not know how far these ideas extend to other species, and where the limits lie for complex mammals. Planarian regeneration is not just a scaled-down version of human healing. Mammals tend to form scars where other animals restore tissue. Even in us, regenerative capacity varies. The adult human heart has extremely limited repair capabilities. We do not know for certain if bioelectric attractor memory works in adult human tissues the same way it does in regeneration-rich creatures, but it expands our understanding of what control can mean in biology, guiding research in wound healing and tissue engineering. This principle blurs the intuitive line between signal and structure. We are used to thinking of structure as a physical thing, shape, anatomy, and signals as fleeting instructions, but in living systems, they are intertwined. A stable bioelectric pattern is a signal, but it is also part of the structure, as it is persistent and guides restoration. The body begins to look less like a machine with parts and more like a system with tendencies. When you cut a planarian, you are not just damaging matter, you are disturbing a dynamic system that seeks to return to a preferred state. The word memory, used carefully, reflects this sense of resilience. Memory not as history or an image, but as stability, the ability of a system to return to a form it recognizes, without being aware of it. Such memory does not sit in a single cell and does not require a narrator. It arises from the interactions of many cells and is expressed as a return to form. This is not a mystical phantom blueprint, but a set of attractors in a living network. From hidden maps inside the flesh, we move to the outside world, where other animals have learned to perceive electricity as an external landscape. You stand at a river's edge at twilight. You know that all life in the water consists of charged particles and ionic separation. Your body runs on voltage differences, but you do not feel it. You do not sense the living fields around you, the way you feel heat or vibration. Here lies a strange paradox. If your body is electrical, why do you not feel the fields of other creatures? The answer is not that the electricity is too weak. In water, it is so useful that evolution turned it into a sense. Your nervous system became brilliant at sight, hearing, and touch. In several aquatic lineages, something else happened. Water became a medium through which voltage changes could travel, and animals learned to listen to this medium. Electroreception has evolved more than once because water conducts electricity far better than air, and living organisms leak weak electrical potentials simply by virtue of being alive. A classic example is the ampullae of Lorenzini in sharks and rays. These are sensory organs on the head connected to the skin surface by gel-filled canals. This gel is a conductive medium. The animal does not measure electricity like an engineer with a meter. It uses tissue that has become exquisitely sensitive to potential changes, translating external fields into neural signals. A shark can detect the electrical signature of prey hidden under sand, where vision is useless. This sixth sense is not mysticism, but physics. An electrical field is not blocked by darkness or distorted by currents the way scents are. Alongside the perception of weak fields, some animals have developed the ability to generate strong ones. Electric eels, rays, and catfish are living demonstrations of what muscle tissue can become when evolution reorganizes it. Electric organs often originate from modified muscle cells called electrocytes, arranged in stacks. Each electrocyte is like a small battery. Individually, their voltage is low, but when thousands of these cells are connected in series, the voltage adds up. An electric eel can generate discharges capable of stunning prey. Some fish create weak fields not for attack, but for communication and navigation. Active electrolocation, detecting distortions introduced by objects into their own field. It is important to distinguish between two skills: generating strong fields and sensing weak ones. Generation requires an organ architecture capable of synchronizing electrocytes. Sensing requires receptors of extraordinary sensitivity. Both skills depend on the control of ion channels, the same toolkit that, in other contexts, provides muscle contraction and nerve impulse transmission. This is one of biology's deep themes. Life reuses its tools, and novelty more often arises from reorganization than from invention from scratch. The ecological context explains why this sense became viable in water rather than on land. Air is a poor conductor, and the fields of terrestrial animals dissipate too quickly to become a stable communication channel. Water, by contrast, is an electrolyte medium. It supports the propagation of fields and the coupling of organisms' electrical signatures. The water itself becomes part of the sensory apparatus, a medium carrying information. This is why electroreception repeatedly appears in aquatic or amphibious lineages, and is rarely found as a dominant sensory channel in fully terrestrial animals. There are exceptions and specialized cases in nature where electrical or electromagnetic signals play a role, but classic high-resolution electroreception systems are aquatic for a reason that is almost embarrassingly physical. Environment matters. A sense is not just a receptor, it is a receptor plus the world. In water, the world cooperates with this sense. In air, it does not, at least, not in such a practical way. Your lineage, having been predominantly terrestrial for a long time, built senses optimized for air, light, sound, and chemical signals. Other lineages, living in conductive darkness and sediment, built a sense of charge. This shifts the evolutionary perspective from curiosity to something close to humility. Biological electricity is not only internal coordination, it can become a medium of perception. An animal can treat the electrical life of other organisms as part of its environment, like plumes of scent or vibrations. This means that there are worlds layered on top of the one you inhabit. Not metaphorical worlds, but sensory ones. The The same pond can be visually dull and acoustically quiet, yet electrically alive, with contours that signify prey, a predator, a partner, an obstacle, or a boundary. For an electroreceptive shark, a hidden fish is not just a shape in the sand. It is a pattern of voltage leakage, a slight distortion of the field, a clue that something living is there. For an electric fish, using active electrolocation, a submerged object is not just a solid item. It is a distortion of the emitted charge, a change in resistance and capacitance that the nervous system is capable of interpreting. We do not know for certain how much of this perception is innate, and how much is learned in each species, and we must not pretend that this sense is a simple magical map, but the facts suggest that it is functional, spatially informative, and behaviorally powerful. It allows animals to detect what would otherwise remain hidden. It makes predation and navigation possible in conditions where our dominant senses would struggle. The quiet realization here is not so much that electric eels are dramatic, as it is that you are limited. What seems to us an invisible property of life becomes, for other animals, a world of contours, a second geography written in charge. When you hear this, it is tempting to think of human perception as incomplete, as if we are missing a layer of reality that would make everything clearer. In reality, every species is missing something. Every nervous system is a compromise shaped by ecology. The human compromise has been extremely successful, but it is still a compromise. You can create tools to detect electric fields, to amplify them, visualize them, and translate them into graphs and sounds. But your skin does not do this natively. Your brain was not shaped to interpret this channel as an everyday sense. This is not a failure. It is a reminder that what you call reality is, in part, a function of what your body is capable of measuring without tools. Other animals live within other dimensions. They inhabit different subsets of the physical world, and for them, electricity is not only something that happens inside a cell or on a membrane. It is a property of the water itself, as readable as a footprint. After all this evidence, the final question is not whether you are electrical, but what kind of creature that makes you in an age full of artificial currents. Imagine this. You live your whole life inside a web of power lines, chargers, routers, screens, motors, transformers, batteries, and invisible signals that were never part of the world in which your nervous system originally evolved. And yet, your heart still keeps time. Your cortex still dives into the rhythms of sleep. Your cells still hold their gradients like small, guarded cliffs. If your body is built on voltage, what happens when you spend your life surrounded by electricity that does not belong to you? This question can easily slide into fear, because fear loves what cannot be seen, and modern electricity is mostly invisible. But a common way toward it is to ask exactly what kind of electricity we mean. The word is the same, but the physics and biology are not interchangeable. Your living voltage is primarily ionic. It is charge separated by membranes in salt water, maintained by pumps and channels, and used for timing. The electricity that powers cities is mostly electromagnetic fields, and moving electrons in conductors, shaped by engineering constraints rather than cellular membranes. They can interact because everything charged can interact. But the boundary worth understanding is the difference in scale, coupling, and mechanism. The nervous system is not a free-floating antenna in a vacuum. It is a wet, layered organ that evolved to self-coordinate from the inside out using gradients that are continuously restored. When we talk about external fields, the first honest step is to stop treating all electricity as one substance, and start viewing it as different phenomena sharing a common name. The revelation is that the modern environment overlays external electromagnetic signals onto a nervous system running on an internal ionic glow, and that the difference between these two kinds of electricity is the very real boundary worth understanding. Internal bioelectricity is about membranes creating a voltage difference through selective permeability, and cells using that difference to open channels, propagate signals, and coordinate tissue behavior. External electricity in most human contexts is about fields and currents generated by power systems and wireless communications, propagating through space and materials. These fields can induce currents in conductive tissues under certain conditions, and can transfer energy, especially at high intensities. But how they couple with the body depends on frequency, field strength, distance, geometry, and the electrical properties of the tissues. The membrane potential of a living cell is measured in tens of millivolts, across a structure measured in nanometers, and it exists within a crowded biochemical environment where channels open and close based on local conditions. An external electromagnetic field is not a membrane voltage. It does not automatically translate into a biological command. It is a physical influence that, at sufficient strength or in specific configurations, can perturb ions or currents. But the body possesses layers of shielding and dissipation, and it has homeostatic systems that constantly adjust and stabilize its state. The mind often wants one simple statement: either external fields are harmless, or they secretly control everything. The facts suggest that reality is less dramatic and more technical. There are well-studied mechanisms at high levels of exposure, particularly the heating of tissues from absorbed energy in certain radio frequency ranges, and there are established safety frameworks built around measurable effects. There are also open questions about subtle effects at low levels, partly because subtle is hard to measure in living systems that change and adapt, and partly because human perception and anxiety can alter physiology in ways that look like an external influence, even when the cause is internal. If we want to remain honest, we have to hold both truths simultaneously. The body is physical and can be influenced, and the body is also a noisy organism sensitive to expectations, and separating the two is difficult. What we can reliably measure in humans remains beautifully grounded in ionic biology. An electrocardiogram does not measure the electricity in your wall socket. It measures the aggregate electrical consequences of cardiac depolarization and repolarization as they spread through tissue, and create a voltage difference recorded on the skin. An electroencephalograph does not read external signals in the air. It reads synchronized activity in cortical populations large enough to reach the scalp, through the skull and skin. Nerve conduction studies do not capture some vague aura of energy. They measure the speed and integrity of action potentials traveling along peripheral nerves, and the response of muscles to stimulation. These tools are not perfect, but they are among the most reliable windows we have into living voltage, because they are tied to mechanisms we can describe: membrane potentials, ionic currents, channel kinetics, and tissue conductivity. They remind us what the word electrical means inside the body. It means gradients maintained by pumps, channels that regulate permeability, and waves of depolarization that carry information by recreating a pattern in space. When clinicians interpret these signals, they are not interpreting external fields. They are interpreting coordination. And coordination has its signatures. A heart rhythm shows timing. A seizure shows synchronization. A demyelinating neuropathy shows slowing of conduction. In all these cases, the measurement is tied to physiology that can be humbly linked to tissue structure and molecular function. This is the stable ground beneath the thesis of this issue. The living voltage that thinks is not a metaphor, but it is also not the current from a socket. It is biological order built on separation and used for timing. The ground becomes more precarious in questions about the subtle effects of environmental fields, especially in everyday conditions, and this is where intellectual discipline is important. In biology, the most dangerous thing is not a specific hypothesis. It is a hypothesis that cannot be separated from confounding factors. Studies of environmental exposure in humans often face difficulties because humans are not identical. The environment is not controlled, and exposure correlates with other variables. A person who worries about electromagnetic fields might sleep worse, and poor sleep alters heart rate variability, attention, inflammatory markers, mood, and subjective symptoms. A person living near a noisy road might have stress responses that matter more than any field measurements. A person who uses a phone actively might also follow patterns of behavior affecting sleep, posture, light exposure, and social stress. Expectation alone can generate real symptoms, not because the symptoms are fake, but because the nervous system is designed to generate bodily states in response to belief and vigilance. This is why the literature on low-level field exposure can become emotionally charged. One side points to subjective reports and correlations. The other points to controlled studies and inconsistent reproducibility. The facts suggest that for many claimed subtle effects, it is difficult to separate physiology from expectation and anxiety. And this very difficulty is a clue. If an effect is real but small, it will be buried under everyday variability unless studies are carefully designed, sufficiently powered, and replicated. If an effect is primarily mediated by stress and expectation, it can still be real for the person experiencing it, but the mechanism is internal rather than an external field's direct effect on tissue. Neither conclusion is an insult. There are different stories about causality. The honest position is to acknowledge uncertainty where it exists, avoid loud claims in either direction, and remember that modern science is most trustworthy when it can replicate results across different methods and populations. The deeper continuity, which does not depend on the outcome of any single environmental dispute, is how voltage behaves within life across different scales. Whether in the sleeping cortex diving into slow waves, in an embryo establishing domains that guide structure, or in a peripheral nerve transmitting signals across the body. Voltage acts more like a language of coordination than like a fuel. Cells do not burn voltage the way they burn glucose. They maintain separation, then spend that separation as timing, then restore it. They create readiness by keeping ions unevenly distributed, and then use that unevenness to open the gates at the right moment. In this sense, the electricity in you is not a resource to be consumed once. It is a structure to be maintained, a dynamic architecture that makes reliable timing possible. This is why the brain's energy demand is so closely tied to maintaining gradients, and why disruptions that destroy gradients, such as severe hypoxia, are so catastrophic. Life, at least complex animal life, is built on the ability to hold back equilibrium. It holds it back at membranes, in compartments, in tissues, and then uses the stored differences to coordinate action. This is the quiet conclusion of this issue's thesis. To be alive is to maintain separation and then spend it, again and over again, as timing. External electricity may surround you, but it is not the same kind of order. It is not restored by your cells. It is not tuned to your membranes. It is not the intimate grammar by which a thought arrives exactly when it arrives. So, you are electrical, but you are not machines. A machine can be defined by input and output, by a power source and a function. And although the body can be described in engineering terms, the body is more elusive. It is a system that anticipates, corrects, compensates, and reconfigures. It is a set of tendencies that return to stable states after a disturbance. Its electricity is not an external commodity. It is internal work paid for by metabolism, guarded by membranes, and distributed across tissues in patterns that make integrity possible. This makes the final point both simple and strangely intimate. The most intimate electricity in your life is not in the walls or the air, but in the quiet gradients you restore every second without noticing. If you want to reduce superstition in an age full of invisible signals, the most effective step is not to deny the physical world, but to learn exactly what kind of physical world you actually are. Your body's voltage is local, membrane-bound, ionic, and functional as timing. External fields are spatial, engineered, and subject to different constraints. They can become significant in certain intensities and contexts, and these contexts are studied using tools that are getting better. But the basic story of what it means to be alive does not change with the invention of power grids. You remain a creature of carefully held separation, living in a continuous act of resisting the pull of equilibrium. Your cells constantly refuse to let the salty world inside you become uniform, because uniformity would be silence. And somewhere beneath your thoughts, beneath your plans, beneath your name, a small living voltage continues to organize the darkness into a body that holds together. Long after the lights of our cities go silent, the deeper story will remain the same. Life was never made of still matter, but of carefully held charge rehearsing order against the pull of equilibrium.